How do you put a surcharge on digital services? If you're searching on Google, what are they going to do?
They tax it.
How do you tax someone for search?
No, not for Google search, but they tax each download on an iPhone.
Wow.
That
would be insane.
No, completely. It's completely. But they have, the EU has given itself these instruments. It's called an anti-coercion instrument. So if somebody puts a tariff on them, then they can claim this is coercion. And then it gives them, and it's a bit like the hammer that looks for nails to.
Yes, so every to a hammer, everything is a nail.
That's what it is, and it's the same. If the Commission has an instrument, it wants to use it, and that's and there is a danger that this 90-day reprieve, it's not going well at the moment. There was the European Trade Commissioner was in Washington. He was negotiating. He didn't come back with anything. It's difficult to make business in Europe.
Hi, I'm Steve Eisman, and welcome to my podcast, the Eisman Playbook. In my 35 years of experience of investing in markets, I've seen many ups and downs. You might know me because I was depicted in the book The Big Short by Michael Lewis and portrayed by Steve Carell in the movie of the same name. In this podcast, we are going to explore and analyze market trends, companies, and subsectors with various guests in and around the financial world. My goal here is simple: to educate. So come and join me as I share with you the Eisman Playbook. Hi, and welcome to another edition of the Eisman Playbook. It is April 16th. It's 3:00 in the afternoon, New York time. It's different times elsewhere. Wolfgang Münchau is our guest today. I'm going to introduce him in a second. And Wolfgang, where are you?
I'm in Oxford, UK.
Oh, very fancy. So today, our guest, we're going to explore something that is a kind of a pet project of mine, which is the end of paradigms. And a paradigm is a set of ideas that are so embedded in your head, you don't even know anymore that they actually exist. And paradigms, as I've said in the past, end in one of two ways. Either over time they erode, and they erode so much that it becomes clear to just about everyone that the paradigm no longer works, or that's the most common way that a paradigm ends, or once in a while, like in the great financial crisis, the whole world gets hit over the head by a 2x4, and everybody, after waking up and says, what just happened, realizes that everything that they thought before is wrong. So we're going to explore today the end of the German economic miracle. And we're also going to explore how relevant that is to the rest of Europe. We're going to talk tariffs because, of course, everybody talks tariffs. And my guest today, as I said, is Wolfgang Münchau. Let me read your bio just quickly so everybody can know who you are. He's a co-founder and director of Euro Intelligence, and he also writes a weekly column on European affairs for various newspapers all over Europe. And he was, for many, many years, a columnist in the Financial Times through 2020. So again, Wolfgang, welcome.
Thank you, Steve, for having me.
So Wolfgang, we have never met. We have never spoken. So let me tell you how you got here, because I think it's kind of interesting. At least it is to me. So a few months ago, as I was planning the creation of this podcast, I drew up on a piece of paper all the various topics that I would want to discuss and learn about. And one of them was, I basically called it, what's the matter with Europe? And, if you look at the European economy, for example, in 2007, the size of the EU GDP was a little bit over $14 trillion, roughly equivalent to US GDP at exactly the same time. And today, European GDP is 19 trillion, up from 14, and US is 29 trillion. The growth rate of the US has been more than double Europe. So I started to try and do some research to see what I could learn. And I basically found almost nothing. I couldn't find any books. I asked a friend if he knew anything. He said, why don't you read Mario Draghi's white paper, which he put out last year. So for those of you who don't know, Mario Draghi was the head of the European Central Bank. He was also Prime Minister of Italy. He wrote this 100-page white paper just talking about how Europe could improve its growth rate. And I fell asleep on page 10 because it was so unbelievably boring. It was clearly written not to anger anyone. And I read the whole thing and I said, that was a complete waste of a couple of hours of my life. So I went back on Amazon. I typed in, what's the matter with Europe? I didn't get anything. But then I saw this book. And the book has a great title. It's called KAPUT, The End of the German Economic Miracle by Wolfgang Münchau. So I figured this could be worth my time. So I read the book. I think I read it in one sitting. Wolfgang, my compliments. It's fabulous. I'm sure pissed off a whole bunch of people in Germany when it got published. And I really learned a lot. And I figured, you know what? I need to talk to this guy. So here you are. So welcome.
Well, thank you. It hasn't been published in Germany yet. That's going to piss them off this summer when it will be
published.
It
hasn't been published in Germany yet?
No.
Oh, my.
As you can read in the book, things take a little longer in Germany. So this will happen in the summer.
I started reading it. I read it literally in one session, and I thought it was great because, first of all, I want to congratulate you because I really learned a lot, which is not always true when you read people's books. And I think this was a great opportunity to explore not just what's going on in Germany, but how that applies to the rest of Europe. And then we'll talk about tariffs because God help us all, we can't help but talk about tariffs and how the impact of President Trump on Europe, in your view. And so let me start with just the beginning of the book, and let's just lay the groundwork. You describe German economic policy, which has been around for decades, as Neo-Mercantilism. So believe me when I tell you, most of the people who are listening to this podcast don't really know what that means because we don't have that here in the United States. So let's start with the definition. What do you mean by that?
Well, you don't have it now. You may soon have it. Mercantilism comes from France. It was a French idea in the hundreds of years ago. It was the idea that in those days of gold standard currencies, it was the idea that you would amass gold to the state by selling more than you import, by exporting more than you import. So the economy was geared towards exporting and consuming less than it exports, so generating export surpluses. And with these export surpluses, with gold-based currencies, you would amass gold to the national treasury. And the idea was to make the country rich as a result of these policies. Obviously, not everybody can pursue these policies. It's very much
it's a zero-sum game
That's
in
right.
that sense.
It is, absolutely.
If you got a surplus, somebody's got a deficit.
Indeed. And as long as we're not trading with Mars, this is still going to take place be the case for a long time. So all these surpluses and deficits have to add to zero. Interestingly, something not necessarily understood in European countries widely enough, because it is very much in the popular debate that people say having surplus is a good thing, having a deficit is a bad thing. We're not talking about budget deficits. We're talking about current account deficits, trade deficits, and trade surpluses. So there's nothing good or bad about trade surpluses. I don't think they need to balance every year. But the situation in Germany is very different. It's not only that they don't, not balance every year. The Germans have a surplus every year. And if they don't have a surplus, they have a recession. And the German surplus is massive. It's, in the years before the pandemic, it was 8.5% of GDP. The surplus, not the trade, the surplus in the trade. And this is a large economy. Now, the Dutch, much smaller country, have an even bigger surplus. And it doesn't matter. Iceland probably has a bigger surplus. I haven't checked this, but small islands, it doesn't matter. But for the third largest economy in the world, to have a surplus of that size does matter. And for China, being the second largest economy in the world, having an even bigger surplus also matters. So these are this is the mercantilism. This is not the situation that people run surpluses. It is the situation where the policy of the country and the way the country organizes itself is designed to create those surpluses. And that's what you don't have in the United States. The United States doesn't function like that. But Germany and European countries function like that. But it is a particular German thing.
So how did that evolve from just the idea that we want to export? And as the statistic that I heard the other day is that exports constitute about 40% of German GDP. So it's an export-driven economy. How did it evolve from that to Germany basically focusing on industrial type companies, manufacturing type companies, as opposed to technology or services? Because it's not, you don't have to, if you're going to be an exporter, that's one thing. But they took it from exporting to we're going to be an industrial manufacturing economy. How did one evolve to the other?
Germany was always an industrial exporter before it had those surpluses. It was the other way around. And the way Germany actually had a fairly balanced external balance until about the end of the last century. Until about 2000, 2002, there was nothing particularly worrying about the German external balance until about 25 years ago. But it was always an industrial country. Now, there were two things that happened to the German economy, sort of on a macroeconomic scale. One was German unification, and that just cost them a ton, and it raised taxes. It was a massive macroeconomic shock, including for the corporate sector. And the second was the start of the euro, which Germany foolishly entered in with a really undervalued, with an overvalued exchange rate, and it sort of lost competitiveness as a result of that imbalance, and it took a number of years, reforms and other things to kind of iron out. But then a number of things happened, and then there was a government in the early part of the century which felt that it was very much geared towards industry. It was very much geared towards the heavy end of industry, and they wanted to the car industry in particular. And so they reformed the economy. There's an awful lot of applause about this, that, when they say so Germany is reformed, and that's what they did. They made Germany more competitive. And if you actually follow the discourse in Germany about the economy.
So you're saying back in kind of around the early 2000s, there was labor reform, costs came down, they got much more competitive. And as you describe in the book, from 2005 until roughly 2015, 2018, it was kind of like a golden age because everything was working really well. They were exporting a lot of cars, they were exporting a lot of other things, and Germany was doing great.
It was absolutely right, and everything came together for them. Even the euro crisis, which seemed to
that helped because the euro goes down and helps exports.
That's exactly, and it was a real devaluation. There was no inflation, so they actually had a 20% or so cut in the exchange rate, and with no price, with no cost associated with this.
Right.
They had the Chinese market at that time. The China was complementary to Germany. Germany sold industrial goods to China and plant and machinery, and China would sell cheap consumer goods to the rest of the world. They were wonderfully complementary until that flipped, until China started to encroach on German technology, and nowadays they outsell German cars. And certainly they're ahead in the technological development. So these were sort of the waymarks. There were other things like supply chain revolution. If industry was very much.
You described that very well in the book. It was VW that really created it.
Yeah, a lot of these companies, they had the Eastern enlargement of the European Union. At the time there were 10 countries joining the EU with a labor cost like a tenth of labor cost in the West. So
these companies outsource a lot of their supply chain to Eastern Europe.
That's right. What happened in the United States as well. This is sort of not fundamentally different on a bigger scale though, and they also outsourced to China, and that was the other sort of big thing. And so there was the Eurasian continent, which is Europe, Russia, China. This was basically, this is a supply chain network of trains, of shipping lanes, and going through various channels, and it all worked wonderfully. And they had just-in-time production, where the train basically drove right into your assembly line. It was without storage. I mean, they really optimized the whole thing, and it was very, very successful.
So before we get to the end of the economic, I want to explore this some more, because there are aspects to this that are so alien to an American audience that I really think we need to delve deeper first into this. So, for example, you describe in the book that it's not just industry that was doing this. It was government policy. It was the banks were also, it was like everybody was involved. It was like everybody went to college together. They all were in the same fraternity. some guys ran banks, some guys ran the government, some guys ran industry. They all got together in the room, they cooked this up, and they all pulled their oars together. So can you elaborate a little bit about how government, banks, and industry were basically all in this together?
Yeah, no, I think you kind of summarized it. They all they all did this, and the mechanisms through which they do this is the state-owned banking sector. The first chapter of my book was on the financial sector because it's
something I know a little bit about. But go ahead.
I'm sure you do, and but you probably haven't seen a financial sector quite like this, because this is one that is run. This is a third of the German banking sector state-owned, and the state government, basically government at various levels, state and federal government. Germany has a very similar political system in the United States. So federal and state governments have a heavy influence on the way these banks are run. And if sometimes if they cannot get anything through the budget, then they can get a bank to support whatever.
So in other words, if we can't get a government program to build,
that's right,
a chemical plant, let's say, I call up my buddy who was in my fraternity or something like that, who's running the local state-owned bank, and say, hey man, bail me out, go make a loan to these people so they can go build the plant.
Yeah, it's actually worse than that.
Please, how is it worse?
It's worse because you, the politician, you're most likely to sit on this bank's supervisory board.
You're on the board as well.
Yeah, you actually take
you don't have to call him up, you just meet him at the board meeting.
Yeah, you tell him.
Right.
So it's and you may also sit in the supervisory board in the chemical company, and I think that's when things get when these deals got stitched up from both ends, and the banks no longer acted like banks; they acted like essentially slush funds, and that was.
So just to elaborate for a second, so pre-crisis, when I was learning how to short subprime paper, the guy from Deutsche Bank who came to my office to teach me how to do it, he had this very, very funny quote where we kept asking him, we kept saying, I don't understand this. This paper is so bad. Who's buying it? And he'd always say the same thing, Dusseldorf. So that's these people.
That's right. I quoted you in the book on this.
Yes, believe me, I complimented the quote. I just remember, now I got to meet somebody who actually knows the people in Dusseldorf.
I do. I'm from that area, and I can tell you this is absolutely true. And this was a bank, in particular. This bank doesn't exist anymore because it bought your paper.
This is West LB.
West LB, and West LB was one of the so-called Landesbanken, and they are state-owned banks. It was the largest one and the meanest one, and it was really this local state government's bank. And it was you could call it a family. I wouldn't call it organized crime, but it was organized in every way that organized crime is organized. Like the government, everybody was in on it, and you would they would organize mergers, hostile takeovers of other companies, and they didn't have sort of thresholds for share declarations, and there wasn't the usual transparency that you would have in a mature financial market. They would just buy the shares in secret, and then the government would buy some shares, and then another friendly bank would buy some shares. Then you would pool them. Then you own the company. It's that kind of
incestuous
business, and a lot of bad deals got done in this, and a lot of bad decisions got taken, and that was the 1990s. And the 1990s was a period when a lot of things went wrong for Germany macroeconomically. They completely messed up the funding for unification. Instead of letting East Germany develop and grow, they imposed West German salaries, West German standards, and East Germany basically went to the dogs and needed government subsidies and tax subsidies that persist to this day. And it's a sort of a tax surcharge that people have to pay for this giant macroeconomic mismanagement. I think it was the cost of the East German transition was $1 trillion.
Wow.
$1 trillion and counting still. So this is still.
So let me press something else. So this entire incestuous government, banks, industry basically pushed Germany very hard as possible to be a manufacturing powerhouse, where you were focused on traditional autos, chemicals, machinery. And so could you describe why that system failed so your mobile in Germany is poor. You're behind in digital. Why did this system, which was pulling all its oars towards manufacturing, not pivot really at all towards technology or digital or mobile, et cetera, as you describe in your book? Like, how did that happen? Why did it not pivot?
The short answer is that it wasn't invented in Germany. The German manufacturing sector, you mentioned cars, chemicals, all this stuff is stuff Germans invented. That was, the car was invented by a German in the 19th century. A lot of the chemical processes were invented by Germans in the 19th century. What was not invented is the transistor and the semiconductor. And while German, Jewish scientists in Germany were at the forefront of quantum research in the 1920s, Germany lost the entire sector, the entire know-how on quantum mechanics, and its military, but then also its civilian applications. And out of the Manhattan Project grew the transistor, the entire tech revolution. And as we saw with the car, it's a very similar development. The car was invented in the 19th century and generated massive profits still 100 years later. And these technological cycles are very long. They have come to an end in Germany. The 19th century physics, chemistry, classic physics that got them a long way. And it was a profitable sector. And this is why the country generated relatively high profit margins, relatively good growth in those years, and the organization, what I call as a sort of the kind of corporatist, way of doing business with the government, the banks, and the industrialists all working together. That was often seen in Europe as an advantage, like a strength of the German model. I think about a year or two before I published my book, there were still people in the UK who wrote books to say why the Germans, do it better than everyone else. This has a lot of fans. This model, it's a sort of a socialist type, business model. And my view was always, if it works, it works. But it stopped working a long time ago, and it was basically you were kind of living of old technologies and old inventions. And there also came with this a certain arrogance. And I do remember these, speaking to German tech people in the 1990s who told me that that they did not believe in digital technology. They were still developing analog telephone exchanges.
I understand that this technology stuff was not invented in Germany. I get that. So there's something of pride involved. But clearly everybody wanted a mobile phone. And yet Germany was very, very slow to, go fully mobile. The world's going digital, and Germany's very, very slow to go digital. And then the problem starts to compound itself. If you're going to go to electric cars, you need mobile, you need digital. So you're not going to be able to pivot to let's say, electric cars if you don't have that infrastructure. So again, why? It's one thing for everybody to be pushing for manufacturing. It's another thing to say we don't want mobile phones or we don't want them too much. I don't know. From your book, I don't quite understand why Germany, for example, was so slow building out mobile.
Yeah, I think the thing is cultural. I have to say the Germans have an issue with this stuff. And the Germany I grew up in was very techno friendly, and we were all sort of at the edge. And the Germans saw themselves as right at the top there with the Americans, with some people from Asia, but the top end of Asia. And there was no question of us falling. But as the 90s progressed, Germany was fairly rich by then compared to previous generations. Its technology, its industry worked. There was a sense of superiority. Digital was not taken seriously. And I think nobody in Germany, especially in the corporate sector, did think that digital would encroach on what they did. It was this sort of...
it was like a toy.
It was a toy. There was the arrogance was particularly strongly felt in the car industry, where the idea of an electric car, real man would not drive an electric car. That was sort of the attitude that with which these people approached the issue. The chairman of Volkswagen, who's the biggest German car company, famously said, and this was only about 10 years ago, that there is no space for an electric car in my garage. And, his garage is rather big because Volkswagen has
I'm probably sure he has a lot of cars.
He has a lot of cars because he has a car from all the brands. He's got a Volkswagen, he's got an Audi, he's got a Bentley, and, quite a few others. But there wasn't the space for an electric car in his garage. He basically says, look, if you want to succeed in my company, don't even talk about it.
So and basically what you're describing is a paradigm problem.
It's a paradigm problem.
The entire country pulled in one paradigm.
Absolutely. And
things change. So let's focus on that. I want to read a paragraph from your book, which I wrote down because I liked it so much. And what you wrote, the fundamental problem with the German neo-mercantilist system is about its lack of sustainability. It is simply not a good business model. My argument against neo-mercantilism is primarily on political risk management. It is not a good idea to be dependent for your economic prosperity on the industrialists like VW with its legacy fuel cars or on BASF with its mass chemical production, nor is it a good idea to be dependent upon Russian gas and oil. And it is certainly not a good idea to become dependent on China, but unfortunately, this is what happened. So let's talk about when did the wheels start to come off, and how did Germany react to the wheels beginning to come off?
Yeah. You can talk about causes and when the wheel came off. The economy was already in the state that you quoted, and it had been in that state for 10 years before the wheels came off. And they were lucky for 10 years because of a number of lucky things happened to them. The first thing that really happened to them was Brexit. It's the UK leaving the EU because the UK was highly integrated into German supply chains. Now, nothing fundamentally sort of big happened that moment. There's not like something exploded or imploded, but it was the first trade disintegration that happened to Germany. And German companies were heavily invested in UK supply chains. Here in Oxford, where I live, there is a big factory by BMW. They built a mini car. Iconic British car, and this is a classic case of German investment. There will be lots of other smaller, medium-sized manufacturers that ship goods to and fro Germany and the UK. With Brexit, things ended. They still have the mini plant, and this is still going well. But a lot of this trade integration and supply chain integration has certainly slowed down. And you see it in the German industrial production figures. Around 2017, things started to slow down. There was nothing else happening in the world economy. The world economy was doing well. There was no war. There was no pandemic. There was 2017, pretty good years actually in the global economy. Then the next thing was, of course, the pandemic. And Germany was hit, I wouldn't say Germany was hit harder than others. Germany had a better fiscal stimulus than other countries because it's a rich country. It could support people. So the GDP didn't come down by as much as it could have been, but it didn't actually increase as much afterwards. And this is it was sort of a stasis thing. So, if you think it's sort of geographically.
Hasn't German GDP been flat for the last few years?
It has been. The last 3 years been completely flat. But
flat.
But at the pandemic, people didn't realize this. They thought, it'd come back, but it didn't. It came back in the United States. And in fact, in the United States, the economy rejoined the old growth trajectory. In Germany, it was just dramatically different. The old growth trajectory is just totally out of reach now. It completely flatlined after the pandemic, but not on the level that it was before, at a lower level. And industry declined even from that level. Not only relative to the United States and the rest of the world, but also vis-a-vis Europe itself. So this was something fairly dramatic that happened. And for the last 3 years, Germany has had zero growth. I think last year it was a recession. Last 2 years were a recession. This year is still a recession. So this is a very long thing. It's actually not a recession. It
doesn't sound like a recession. It sounds like an economy in deterioration.
Yeah, that's what it is. That's what it is, exactly.
So let's talk about that. So talk about why the economy is deteriorating. Talk about electric cars. Talk about the Russia gas situation, how that all has woven into a situation where basically Germany is not growing at all.
In 2004, when they reformed the economy, they had good products. And it was essentially, cost cutting, the classic reforms that you do, labor market reforms. This time they have issues with the product. And in
other words, people don't want to buy cars so much anymore.
That's right.
They want to buy electric cars.
They want to buy other cars, and the Europeans don't actually want to buy electric cars because you don't have charging stations. So you have basically the lack of investment in infrastructure, and the lack of investment by the car companies and the models hasn't produced a lot of enthusiasm for the product. So they're Chinese cars that are not as cheap in Europe as they would be in China. It's sort of, the market hasn't taken off yet. The industry knows that it ends because in Europe, unlike in the United States, it will no longer be allowed to sell ordinary motor cars from 2035. So this has been an agreement. So
it's electric cars or bust.
It's electric cars or bust, or maybe I think they're going to change this rule a little. They're going to allow sort of plug-in hybrids. But it's sort of certainly the classic German diesel car is really past its peak, and there hasn't been much development of them. The German car today is not much different than the German car 10 years ago.
So basically, what you're describing to me is, it's not so much that Germany is not competitive, it's that the world moved on from its products and Germany did not adjust.
That's what happened.
And that's the problem.
That's the problem, yeah. So
if that's the problem, what's going on in Germany to react to this problem? Or maybe they're in denial.
There is a lot of denial, and the denial about their own competitiveness, about innovativeness. For many years, you saw in the newspapers reporting how wonderful Germany is. It was always ahead in the industry, competitiveness ranking, ahead of the United States, despite the fact that economic growth rates were very, very poor. And they always tended to equate their own innovators with the number of patents they have. And I think that was this fundamental misunderstanding when you're talking about paradigm shifts in the world of software and digital. Patents don't matter as much as they did in the world of engineering and especially mechanical engineering. Now, Volkswagen may have still a lot of patents on doorknobs and little widgets in cars, but they don't have a patent on the next generation of the self-driving car technology. And the Germans, even the media, I'm a journalist by training, and I saw this in the media. The German motor journalists is also a group that is part of that sort of.
They're clique. Part of the cabal.
Part of the cabal. They didn't really see their job as being actually pointing. It's a big failure in journalism. That's something what a journalist should do. Be a whistleblower in a situation like that. That didn't happen. It was only about a few weeks ago that I saw for the first time a German journalist saying, "Is it possible that we actually might lose this?" I remember even 2 years ago they were just possibly asking the question like this. Oh my God, if this were to happen, it would be really bad. But fortunately, we're not going to head in this direction. When, I was already writing that it is already happening. And what they have realized, there was this famous test the other day between a BMW and a BYD electric car from China. And the Chinese car could park into a very tight parking slot all by itself.
All by itself. Just press the button.
Just press the button. It found. I think a human would have struggled with it because there was no space on either side. You couldn't have gotten in or out on the side. It was so narrow it was. The BMW couldn't even find the car park. And it's you can see how different these technologies are generations apart, and they are.
So how are the politicians? So I can understand these executives of the car companies being in denial. We've seen this so many times. For example, we did a podcast last week about how Netflix took over the entire media industry, and how all these media companies were in denial because they were legacy media. So I get that. But if you're running the country, you're running the country. You got to think that something is wrong. Is there anything going on in the political classes that are waking people up? Because one of the things that you point out in the book is that whether it's the left or the right, everybody's a neo-mercantilist.
That's right. They all are. And they just formed a government of the left and the right. And it's always the same. There is a great frustration in the political sphere, because no matter how you vote, you always end up with the same government, because Germany has a proportional system where parties typically have the largest party between 15 and 25% of the votes. And nobody ever has a majority, so they have to form coalitions with each other because they don't want to form a coalition with the far right and the far left. So you have these centrist parties. Think about in the United States, you had permanent governments together with Republicans and Democrats all the time. Imagine nothing would ever get done. People would just be, in permanent gridlock. And that's again happened just a few weeks ago. They have agreed another one such coalition where the parties both campaigned for different agendas. The left had a big agenda, but the center right had a big agenda, the conservatives. And they wanted to reform. And I remember Friedrich Merz, the man most likely now to become the German chancellor, he actually had a very good campaign speech in which he said, the German model is broken. I've not heard any German politician ever say that. But then he goes on and negotiates a coalition deal that continues in the same vein.
The same thing. Okay.
Because it's the only power option he has. He cannot leave and say, I don't do this. I want something more radical. He would have to take the far right in, and the far right is also not exactly modernizing an economic modernizer. This is very different. The German far right is very different from the right in the United States. So there are no political options, and the politicians themselves are part of the system.
Right.
So when Olaf Scholz, the outgoing chancellor, he was told about a year ago that Germany had a crisis. He didn't think that would ever be possible. But he was told Germany had a recession, so he called a summit, an industry or an economic summit in his office. Who did he invite? The steel industry, the chemical industry, and the car industry. For him, that's the economy.
That's the economy.
And if you fix the economy, then you fix the problem. And he didn't fix the problem because he didn't fix the economy, because he wanted to fix the car industry, and they get subsidies. And I think ultimately it is, if you had to start fixing this, I mean, people would say, I don't know where to start. I know exactly where I would start. I would start with the financial sector, because the financial sector funds this. If you stop giving money to these companies, they cannot act.
You'd have to reform the entire Landesbanken system, where those companies could no longer be controlled by the politicians. You have to privatize. Absolutely. Yeah, good luck. That's not happening.
No, it's not happening. And the only, this is the real solution to this problem is actually to develop a European-wide capital market. The EU doesn't have a capital market. Every country has a little banking system, because it's more national today than we used to be at the time when the Monetary Union started in 1999. So everybody's retreated into their own sort of national fiefdoms, because the banks hold the other things. The banks hold the treasuries of the governments. So that if there's ever a bond crisis, the banks are basically absorbing.
The banks and the governments are all tied together because they're the biggest owners of
absolutely.
Believe me, that drill I know.
Yeah.
Let's move on. So I think we've beaten Germany to death. I hope they succeed, but at this point, it doesn't sound like there's going to be any real change. So, as someone who's an expert in Germany but also covers Europe, how did what happened in Germany apply in terms of how we should analyze why growth is so slow in Europe?
Germany is about a third of the European economy, and its impact is even larger because politically Germany pulls above its weight, and its weight is pretty high anyway. So what Germany wants, some of the bad policy decisions that were taken domestically were ultimately Europeanized, and the energy policy, the controls of these anti-digital policies. An awful lot of anti-digital policies. You've probably heard of GDPR, the General Directive of Data Protection, which is the reason why websites have these horrendous cookies. This was an EU regulation, and it forces companies to destroy data in regular intervals, meaning that we cannot even use AI to actually generate business models on top of them. We have an energy policy that was premised on AI, cheap Russian gas, and on AI never happening because we would not have enough of it. So the Germans switched off the nuclear power stations and are relying on.
Let's repeat that for a second, because Germany had a nuclear power grid, which I think supplied at its peak about a third of German electricity. And the Greens, who were part of many governments over the last several years, one of their campaign slogans was, "We don't want any nuclear." And so today there's no nuclear in Germany.
That's right. They got
rid of it.
They got rid of it. And the last government, the now outgoing.
So what you're saying to me is that even if it's all circular, even if Germany, the entire country decided we got to go big in AI. I mean, there's no tech sector, but let's imagine that they could do it. They don't have the energy capability to provide enough electricity for what's needed for AI. I mean, we're having enough problems in the United States building enough electrical power. I can't imagine, Germany would be able to come even close. Would you agree?
Absolutely. They have the nuclear power would have been an absolute necessity, a minimum necessity, because it could have supplied about a third of the energy supply. I mean, Germany was one of the top inventors of not inventors, but certainly constructors of nuclear power stations. They were considered to be the best in the world, the safest in the world. It was, built to very high standards. But Germany was also the country that got out of it, and there was a lot of fear in the public. And Angela Merkel, who wasn't particularly anti-nuclear herself, she accelerated the exit of the nuclear industry to 2022, which was the year when Germany then got out a year later. But it was essentially something that wasn't necessary. Even the old power stations could have lasted for another decade at the very least. And there are an awful lot of, and I'm telling you about this when you just said they can't change it. In the heydays in the 1970s, when I went to school, there were lots of dads, not my father, but other fathers of my friends. They worked in the nuclear industry because the city where I grew up was it had one of these big nuclear construction companies, and it was very normal, in my town for someone to be a nuclear physicist or nuclear chemist. And universities had lots of nuclear research facilities. It was a big industry. Today, there are only 3 professors in Germany who research in nuclear sciences.
Wow.
3. And there are 150 professors in gender studies in Germany. But you see how societies change. And in many ways, this is a cultural shift. And these cultural shifts are very, very hard to undo. And, Germany doesn't have what you have in the United States, these radical shifts. And, Germany doesn't go quite as radical in one direction and also not as radical back in the other direction. So we didn't have what you had in the last,
So what you're saying is the story of Germany is a subset of basically all of Europe.
Yes, it is. Europe has gone with it. I just came back from a visit to Poland. And it was also, we talked about the book, because the book has just been translated into Polish.
Before it was published in Germany.
Yeah. It's been published
So it's in English, it's in Polish, but it's not in German.
Oh yeah, in Spanish, in Italian, and quite in Portuguese, Czech. It will be.
Like I said, it's a fabulous book.
It will be published in Germany in the summer. I'll be very interested to answer your first question of our conversation. How
they're reacting in Germany to your book.
I'll be very, very surprised. I think I got a very positive reaction in all the other European countries. Not sure about Germany. I'm slightly nervous about that, but we'll see. Maybe some people will. I've actually some friends have read the book, but they were friends, so I can't.
It doesn't count.
That doesn't count.
Sorry.
So
is there any? So we talked about Germany. There's no sign yet that the political classes or the upper classes are recognizing the nature of the problem.
No.
Do you think in the rest of Europe there is an acknowledgement of what the problem is, or not really?
I don't think so. I mean, in the rest of Europe, people talk about, this is a German problem. In Poland, for example, they're completely dependent on Germany because Poland is the cheap end of the German supply chain network. So is the Czech Republic and Slovakia, especially Slovakia and Poland and some of the Baltic republics. So this is a contagious crisis. And I guess Poland will probably be okay because they're not as saturated. They are not as, they're hungry, they work hard, they're young. There's another thing. Germany is an aging society. It's like Japan. Low birth rate. And low birth rates do something really strange with your policy. People have very strange choices and make, they levy lots of taxes on the old people, levy a lot of taxes on young people. That happens in sort of aging societies, and they're very sclerotic, and Germany is no exception here. France has pursued a slightly different course, but France's model also failed. France is more sort of classic socialist in terms of the state has a much higher share in GDP, but the French state is better run than the German state. In France, you actually have digital infrastructure and actually have great trade. So you could, the French was a bit of an exception when you say this. At least
it hasn't helped in the sense that if you look at the S&P in the United States, the tech sector is 30% of the S&P, but there are companies that are really tech that are sprinkled throughout the other sectors of the S&P, like an Amazon or a Google, which are in communication services. If you add up all the companies that you really would call tech, it's probably 40% of the S&P. In Europe, I don't even think it's 10.
Yeah, absolutely. The biggest tech company in Europe is a German company called SAP.
SAP.
And this is a company that is from 1970. And they were quite smart. I remember, they built software for businesses. They've been doing this, and it's they're a great company. But this is the first generation of digital companies. Nothing happened since. Sweden's got Spotify. Now, Spotify is pretty cool, but that's Sweden.
I use Spotify.
Yeah, so do I. It's a good service. And Sweden.
But what you're saying is, after SAP, basically Germany never created another technology company that matters.
Nor did Europe. And that's they're only 4.
And that's the problem.
In the top 50, I mean, this is a few months that I checked, but it probably wouldn't have changed much. In the top 50 by market capitalization, top 50 tech companies, there are only 4 Europeans. And SAP was the biggest one. And there's the other company called ASML, which makes semiconductor lithography machines. They're a terrific company. They're from Dutch. They're from an offshoot of the old Philips company of the Netherlands. This is basically it, and this is also not a classic tech company. It's essentially the engineering, the mechanic, or the high precision engineering end of the tech company.
To make chips.
It's to make.
They sell you the machine to make the chip.
Yeah, really, yeah.
Right. So it is like a manufacturing.
It's a manufacturing
company in a way.
It is absolutely, except that they're sort of the high end, high sophisticated end, and they.
Correct.
And that's what they are. So the actual tech stuff, AI, the actual, the digital.
There's nothing. Is there any companies in Europe, any startups in Europe that are really in AI that anybody cares about?
There are in AI. There is DeepL, the translation company, translation software. It's very popular here. We're using it all the time. You have to pay for them, but it's they provide some very good translation. But it's a small to medium sized companies. There isn't much. The sad thing is there's a German AI company whose sort of unique selling point is that they understand that the European AI understands European regulation, which is extremely hard and hardly anyone understands it, and you need sort of AI to understand it. It's using the same models that Google invented. It's not like there is any innovation, any tech innovation, or any sort of originality in this. It's just sort of turning something that exists in the United States and turning it into European and making it sort of Euro compliant. But there is very, very little. I think the hope is when you talk to people who are sort of dreaming about this and saying, okay, there could be a better future. Germany has a lot of companies, and the old industrial period produced a lot of excellent companies in these particular sectors, and these companies are sort of slowing down. And one of the reasons they're slowing down is they're not transiting to the digital economy. Now, these companies would have probably a lot of valuable data in them, and they could be leveraged to do some business, but not in Germany. It's not this. They may not even be connected to the grid. I mean, who knows? But it's and that is the sad reality of this thing. So no, there isn't a serious AI business. There's a bit more going on where I live in the United Kingdom. So the triangle between London, Oxford, and Cambridge. There is quite a bit of AI research. I mean, 2 successive prime ministers, the current one and the predecessor, have both championed AI as at least as made it a political priority. that at least is a difference to what happens in Germany. It's not that they put real money behind it, which, you don't probably need to, but it's just, even to say it's a cool thing to do, that would already be a better thing than what the Germans do when they, Olaf Scholz just mocked AI. He thought it's just another way of getting a bad answer to a question.
Sometimes it's a good way to get to an answer to a good question.
But that was sort of the prejudice. So they kind of underestimate. It's the next thing they're underestimating.
All right, so let's switch gears because we're coming down to the end, and let's talk about the topic du jour. President Trump and tariffs. So I'll give you my personal way I look at this, but just to set the stage, but I'm very curious as to how you view it in Europe we also want to know how Europeans are viewing it. So I'll just give you my sort of thing that I've been talking about the last couple of weeks, which is, President Clinton in the 90s sold free trade. He sold NAFTA and he sold the entrance of China into the WTO with two arguments. Argument one was that this would improve GDP growth, and number two was that it would create a lot of jobs. And what I have said is that he was 100% right on the former, and he was dead wrong on the latter. And so in terms of the former, yes, GDP growth improved. It created the beginnings of a massive bull market in the United States, which has lasted with fits and starts basically from 1995 through today, which created a tremendous amount of wealth. It turbocharged the tech sector, all to the good. My view is that the U.S. economy in many ways is more dynamic than it's ever been, maybe in its history. But the downside was, and this is I learned this. It's one thing to learn something intellectually. It's another thing to actually see it. After the Big Short movie, I got this speaking gig where I got to make speeches all over the country, sometimes at universities, sometimes at conferences. And so what would often happen was I would go to parts of the country in the South, the Midwest, that I had never really been to before. You land at an airport, which generally is old. You get in a car, you drive for an hour through towns which have, to put it kindly, have been obliterated. They lost their industry, they lost their jobs. A new home hasn't been built in one of these towns in over a generation. It's utterly depressing. And so what I think President Trump is trying to achieve is basically payback. He's trying to do two things. He's trying to level the terms of trade with as many countries as possible, and he's trying to bring back a lot of jobs to the United States. Those are his two goals. Whether he'll succeed or not, we don't know. But my view about what's going on is that the United States, in terms of negotiating new trade deals, is in the best position possible because only 11% of our GDP comes from exports, and everybody else is over 30. And everybody wants access to the U.S. market. So that's how I see it. What I've said is that if everybody's rational, everybody will try and cut as good a deal as possible with the United States. But that doesn't mean everybody's rational. There's politics involved. If you cut a deal that's too nice, maybe you get thrown out of office. So I don't know how it's going to turn out, but that's kind of how I see the lay of the land from here. I'm not one of these people who gets on CNBC and literally gets hysterical about what President Trump is doing, because I think at least in some ways, what he's trying to do is worthwhile. That's my view, for better or worse. Now what is, from where you sit, given your background, how do you view what's happening here in the United States?
I have some. I also come from an industrial region that got sort of not quite as devastated, but I know what it looks like and what it feels like to have industrial regions being sort of decimated. I've also visited Detroit in the United States and seen what happened there, and that's sort of an older example of this decimation. It's already started before Clinton did NAFTA. So I have sympathies with this. What I see, and also linking in what I wrote, is that these policies will obviously, this is the immovable force of President Trump hitting the irresistible, the irresistible force of Donald Trump hitting the immovable object. of the German economy, and the if the German economy is made to run surpluses, that will no longer be possible, and that is something that will hit a lot of countries. The European instinct is not the German necessarily, but the sort of the Brussels instinct is to hit back with tariffs. They didn't think this through because Trump then hit back, or
hit them back again.
Hit them back again, and he certainly threatened to put tariffs on wine.
Right.
And then the French came and said, "Please not, no, we don't want tariffs on wine, so we should perhaps not retaliate." Now the latest is they're thinking of putting like a surcharge on digital services. They don't work like goods.
How do you put a surcharge on digital services? If you're searching on Google, what are they going to do?
They tax it.
How? How do you tax someone for search?
No, not for Google search, but they tax each download on an iPhone.
Wow.
That
would be insane.
No, completely. It's completely. But they have the EU has given itself these instruments. It's called an anti-coercion instrument. So if somebody puts a tariff on them, then they can claim this is coercion, and then it gives them. And it's a bit like the hammer that looks for nails to.
Yes, to a hammer, everything is a nail.
That's what it is, and it's the same. If the Commission has an instrument, it wants to use it, and there is a danger that this 90-day reprieve. It's not going well at the moment. There was the European Trade Commissioner was in Washington. He was negotiating. He didn't come back with anything. He offered a 0-for-0 deal on tariff, which isn't actually all that much.
It's not so much the tariff.
Exactly.
It's everything else.
Yeah.
It's the VAT tax.
Yeah.
It's all the regulations that restrict things.
Yeah.
It's complicated.
It's difficult to make business in Europe. I mean, for example, an example I always cite is the German motorways. There's no speed limit on it. This isn't because the Germans are speed lovers. This is because the German car industry says if the speed limit goes, we cannot maintain the high regulatory standards we need for like suspension systems and brakes, and you don't have those in America because at 60 or 70 miles an hour. You don't need brakes that are as good as they would have to be if you were able to drive.
If you're going 100.
If you're going 100, or they're going even faster than 100. I mean, in Germany, it's illegal. It's legal to go 150, and at 150, you need something. You need some very different gear.
You need super duper brakes.
Absolutely, you need you need sort of military great stuff, and that's why all these European cars are about on average about twice as expensive as they're in the United States, and you can only get into the European market if you actually supply goods or components on the standard.
So in other words, Ford can't sell its trucks in Germany because it doesn't have military quality brakes.
That's right. Ford has production facilities in Europe, so Ford is very much like another European company.
Okay, but just an example. But somebody else is not going to have the standards because the car is basically not built for 150 miles per hour.
Exactly. And on agriculture, now, if you when I visit New York and I go to a restaurant, I see the wine menu full of European wines.
Yes.
If you go to a really good restaurant in London is better, but go to Paris or Berlin.
There's only Parisian wines.
It's no American wines.
No, God forbid.
And it's not that they're any worse or anything. I'm a big fan myself.
They just don't let them in.
They just don't let them in.
So let's how is this going to play? Because it seems to me, like I said, if everybody's rational, they're going to have to cut deals because. How is Europe going to survive by not having access to the U.S. consumer? I think it's unimaginable.
The tragedy for the Germans is that they are reliant on China for imports, and they're reliant for the U.S. on exports. Now the U.S. and China are having a trade war, and Germany and Europe getting squeezed on both sides. The Americans will impose. I believe the tariffs will come to the EU. I don't think the EU will cut a trade deal with.
You think the EU is not going to cut a trade deal?
No, because for the Americans, it's not the tariffs. The American delegation. I mean, Commerce Secretary, U.S. Trade Representative Greer, and they all told the Europeans. The Europeans offering a 0-for-0 trade deal. The Americans say, "Look, we want our agricultural goods in. We want our beef. We want our wine." The European Commission can't even couldn't even say yes if it wanted to, because it doesn't have the authority to do that.
Who would have the authority to do that? Each country.
They would all have to come together, and they will never agree on this. This is the trouble with the EU on something as complicated as this. The EU, the Commission can only deal on tariffs, and tariffs is not the issue. So I don't see.
So let's repeat that, because I didn't know that. So what you're saying is the EU as a political entity can only come to the United States and say, we will reduce tariffs to zero.
That's right.
That they can do.
And they did.
But anything else, like you need to reduce your VAT taxes or you need to change your regulations, the EU cannot do any of that. That is a country-by-country story.
It is broadly a country-by-country story. The EU could act, but not the Commission can act. The EU is the member states acting together, but the Commission is like the government of the EU. It has authority to run trade negotiations. It's pretty independent on this. But when it comes to these more regulatory issues, some are national, that's true, but some are actually European, like agriculture is very European, but it's a veto issue. So if France says no, we're not going to do this, then it's not going to happen. So countries, it will be. So
each country would have a veto over. On this, let's say somebody decide, you know what, we got to let American wine into Europe. I just making and Italy says yes, and Germany says yes, and Spain says yes, and France says no, then it's just no?
If France says no, it's not going to happen. And
period.
It's period, and it's for a number of reasons. The Europeans may even be able to outvote France on a technical side, but no one would ever dare to outvote France or Germany on an issue that the president of France
care about.
What they really care about. If the president of France says this is the national interest, and you're not going to outvote us there, nobody will. So then, and it's something, it's going to be very difficult, and the French are currently not minded to actually cut a deal. So I think this will end in no deal. So I think EU and China will probably stay on the other side of the tariff zone. I think the world is going to split into two tariff zones.
So how do you see the split?
Yeah, the split.
Because I can't see Canada and Mexico not cutting a deal. I think that's right. Mathematically impossible.
I agree.
Because 25% of their GDP, if each country's GDP is exports to the United States.
Exactly.
You can't run Canada or Mexico and say, you know what, 25% of our GDP, gone. That can't be.
No, that's right. You can't do this, and they won't do this. There's an election campaign in Canada, as you know, and so people say things that they would probably not say after the election campaign.
Yeah, well, after the election, they'll make nice.
That'll be different. So I agree. That'll be a deal. Various Asian countries will cut a deal. I'm pretty sure South Korea will cut a deal. I'm sure India will cut a deal.
How about Japan?
Japan might. It's Japan is not friendly with China. It has a long history of bad relations with China, and it makes a lot more sense for Japan to cut a deal with the United States. Vietnam will definitely want to cut a deal with the United States, and that's quite important because Vietnam is a part of the diversification. This is where China offshores, or where production has been offshored.
Because everything goes from China to Vietnam to the United States.
Exactly. So these, the United States couldn't completely did what Trump originally wanted, which was to just be, do it, us against the rest of the world. It needs allies for this. The supply chains are more complicated. The world of manufacturing is no longer like a company building things. When you get a company back to the United States, you're actually getting an entire supply chain back.
Right.
And that's the difficulty for the Germans, because their supply chains sit in China. And you're not going to get that company that with moving over to the United States with this Chinese supply chain. That isn't going to work. So this whole tariff thing raises some very, very difficult issues for industrial companies.
What about the UK? You think the UK will cut a deal?
I think so. I think the UK,
because they've been Brexited, so why not?
Well, on that level, it would make sense. The current government is more pro EU, and the Prime Minister Keir Starmer was definitely against Brexit. He has resigned to accept it, and he's not going to reopen Brexit. That's for sure. But in the end, the EU is the bigger trading partner for the UK, and the consideration the UK has to make is that if they go with the United States and the EU doesn't, there will be a global tariff barrier running across the English Channel. And that's something the UK wanted to avoid when it left.
I'm not following you. Repeat that because I didn't quite understand.
Well, I mean, if you have two tariff zones in the world, when Trump cuts a deal with the UK, he will ask the UK to have a tariff against all the countries like China, who are on the other side of the tariffs.
Oh, I didn't know that. So, you think he's going to try and impose?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. This is already. I think
so. The way you see this breaks out is Canada, Mexico, let's say Japan, let's say South Korea, maybe some other Asian countries, probably much of Latin America will cut a deal.
I think so.
And you think maybe the UK cuts a deal, but you think Europe and obviously China will not. And so the world will be bifurcated in that way.
That to me seems the most plausible scenario at this point.
And that would seem to me, assuming you're right, that Europe goes into recession like that. Boom.
Yeah. I mean,
I can't see how they could not.
A recession is quite likely. The bigger question is there life after this?
There's always life after that. What kind of life?
Yeah, I mean, industry is has become very dependent on the United States because the United States is sort of the purchaser of last resort for German industry and for European industry. Without the United States, there wouldn't be any export surpluses because there's nobody to import this stuff. And China plays the opposite role. China is even more mercantilist than the Germans, and they've really beaten the Germans at their own game. And so there isn't anyone in the world, and that role would have to be felt by Europe. Now, you could think of this as in different ways. It could pan out in different ways. One possibility is that Europe takes over the role that the United States played in the last 30 years. That it did this, what Clinton did, that it basically said, okay, let's play the globe, let's try to build the euro into an international reserve currency. We need to build infrastructure for this. We don't have that. We need to create a capital market. We need to create a treasury bond, a European treasury bond, which we don't have. We don't have it for political reasons. So if you created the infrastructure of a proper integrated financial market, outside the US, the euro is the next big currency, not rivaling the US at the moment, but it could well be if the world falls into two rival zones. Now, but this is an Iron Curtain scenario where the US is on one side and Europe is on the other side, and Europe's still reliant on the United States for defense.
Correct.
So
you'd have to build defense. You'd have to build a pan-European banking system. I'll take the other side of that bet.
That's right. Yes, I'm not betting.
The reason why I would take the other side of that bet, knowing what I know about banks and European banks, is just that Europe has problems just making mergers between Italian and German banks, so you would have a much bigger bank that would span all of Europe. They don't want to do that either. So you're kind of stuck.
Yeah, I know. And I think that's also what's telling you. And the European politicians are divided. Giorgia Meloni is close to the United States. France would prefer to go it alone. Germans, as always, sit on the fence. The Poles are pro-American. Others are more anti-American. So you get a different views. But Europe is not united. And to be united, both to cut a deal with Trump, they need to be united, and also to, in order to not cut a deal, they're ending up with sort of it's going to be a messy scenario.
Sounds like it's going to be a muddle, and a muddle is definitely not what you need.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. That was great. I certainly learned a lot. I hope the listeners will learn a lot, and maybe we'll have you back in 6 months to a year because God knows what the world's going to look like then. We can explore it from your vantage point again. And maybe you write another book. Because, by the way, the title, perfect. Love that title.
Stephen, thank you very much.
Thank you. So, again, the name of the book is KAPUT, The End of the German Economic Miracle by Wolfgang Münchau. And thank you, Wolfgang. And we'll see you next week at another episode of the Eisman Playbook. Thank you so much for tuning in. For video episodes of this podcast, head over to our YouTube channel. If you're listening on a podcast platform, make sure to follow the show so you never miss a new episode. And if you got something out of today's conversation, we'd love for you to leave us a 5-star review. It helps us reach more listeners just like you. For links to our website, social media, and to sign up for our newsletter, please check out the show notes of today's episode. On that note, I'm Steve Eisman. I'll see you on our next episode.